Hi and welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of our beginner cross stitch series. So today we're going to start sewing on this cute little joy ornament. Don't worry, this is totally beginner friendly. It's going to be so much fun and easy, you guys will see. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm just going to show you some of the basic stitches you need to get started cross stitching, and also so that you can feel confident to join in our 12 days of Stitchy Ornaments sew along. So before we get started on the joy pattern, I want to just cover the very basic cross stitch, how to do it and how to work with your threads so you're prepared when we start working on our pattern. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways to start it, and then I'm also just going to show you your basic stitch. So if you're working with DMC, you're always going to want to pull from the side that has the number on it. That's just going to make it easier to pull out. So I usually kind of just hold the rest of the skein with one hand and then just pull with the left, and I'll pull out a couple of sections, I think that was 3 sections, and then just cut it off. This is one nice big piece, and if I'm doing embroidery on something like a quilted pillow, I'll actually use all 6 so it's nice and thick, or sometimes 3. For cross stitch, most of the time you're going to need 1 strand, and so you're just going to separate out the ends down here, and hopefully you can kind of see that they're coming apart there. So there's like 6 strands right there. So hopefully you can kind of see those. So I will just grab 1 strand and start pulling, and I just hold the rest of it with my right hand. And as you can see, it's just kind of bunching up over here in my hand, and I just let it do that, just like that. So here's our strand, and then here is the longer piece, and I will just roll that up on my fingers, just like this, and then I will set that aside for use at a later time. Okay, so then we're going to take our strand, and I like to use the loop method, so this is going to be the first, I think it's the easiest way to start, so I'm going to show you that one first. So I've just folded my strand in half, so I've got the raw edges here, and then I've got the looped end right here. And we're going to go ahead and just thread our needle, and to thread my needle, I just pull out my thread, run it on top of my needle just like this, and then squeeze it between my fingers, and then I just bring my needle to my thread, and it's kind of harder to do with these nails because they're longer, but just like that. Okay, so now I've got my raw edges close to my needle, and I've got my looped end away from my needle. Okay, so now that our needle is threaded, we're just going to set that aside for a second. We're going to talk about what a cross stitch stitch looks like. So a cross stitch is basically the method of forming an X with your threads. And so in order to do that X, you obviously have to have a bottom stitch and then a top stitch. Now the only rule that I've really found in cross stitch is that you want to make sure that all your stitches are going the same way, meaning that you want all of your bottom stitches leaning towards the right and then all of your top stitches leaning towards the left. So you don't want it like this where your right leaning stitch is going on top. And the reason is because once you're done doing all of your little X's, as long as they're all going the same way, just like this, and when the light hits the fabric, they're actually going to look all nice and even. If you have some going this way and some going this way, it's actually going to look really messy, and it's kind of going to look like you messed up even if you didn't. So just make sure that you get in the habit of your first stitch is going to be leaning towards the right, and then your completion stitch will be leaning towards the left. So your top stitch will always be leaning towards the left, okay? Now let's talk a little bit about the fabric. So this is 14 count, and what that means is there are 14 little squares in 1 inch, meaning you're going to do 14 little X's in 1 inch. If you have a fabric that is 10 count, that means there's 10 squares in 1 inch. 16 count is 16 squares in 1 inch, and so on. So most patterns will tell you exactly what fabric they use so that you can get the same exact size finished piece. Obviously, if you change your fabric count, your size of your finished piece might differ from the original design. So you're just going to want to keep that in mind. Now I am going to show you a little tip with the fabric. So some fabric like this one is 14 count, meaning you're going to stitch 1 little X per square. If you have a 28 count, which is double this, instead of stitching 28 little X's in 1 inch, you're actually going to stitch over 2. So you're still only going to have 14 X's in your 1 inch. I think that can be a little bit difficult when you're a beginner, so I like to just start off with the 14 count instead, because that way you're just doing 1 X per square, and it's just a lot easier to keep track of. We're going to start, and I'm going to encourage you to start on the 14 count Ada. Now that we've talked a little bit about fabric, let's talk about preparing your fabric. So there's a couple different ways to do it. I know some people who like to just run a zigzag stitch with their sewing machine all along the edge, and that'll kind of keep it from all these little pieces fraying off. I've also seen people use just masking tape and they just mask the edges, and that works as well. I'm actually not going to do either of those today because this fabric is kind of hard and every now and then a piece comes off, but it's not really enough to bug me. So I'm just going to leave it. So you can do whatever you prefer when preparing your fabric. So let's get our threaded needle and our fabric and let's talk about how to make that first stitch. Now, if you remember, I said that your first stitch needs to be leaning towards the right. And so we're just going to pick a hole to come up. So any hole, it doesn't matter. We're going to come up through that hole, but we're not going to pull our thread all the way through. We want to leave this little tail in the back here. Okay, and now in order to make a right leaning stitch, we've come up through this bottom left hole. We want to go in through the top right hole. Hold that up so you can see it. Okay, so now I'm going in through this top right hole right here. And I'll go ahead and grab my needle and pull that through. Don't pull it all the way, and then there you go, we have our right leaning stitch. Okay, now we just need to flip over our fabric, and I'm just going to pick up this loop with my needle and just pull it through. And there we have, it's nice and secured, and now we can continue stitching because we just did that little loop method to secure it. So that's my favorite way to start, and that's called the loop method. Okay, so here we have our right leaning stitch, and now we need to finish that off and make a left leaning stitch. And I'm just holding this in my hand. We can talk about embroidery hoops in a little bit, but I like to just hold it with my hand. That way I can kind of make my fabric nice and taut. I just kind of hold it like this, and it makes it easier for me to stitch, but you can do whichever is easier for you. So now we have our right leaning stitch. We need to make that left leaning stitch to complete it off. So we're going to come up in this bottom right corner now, and then we're going to go down in the top left corner. Oh. And there we have our one little completed X. And so now let's go ahead and just do a couple more. Bottom left to top right. So we've got our right leaning stitch, and then we can come up in the bottom right and finish off in the top left. Okay, so now we have 2 stitches, and we can just continue doing that based on our pattern. Let's do one more. Bottom left to top right, and bottom right to top left. Okay, and that's how you can just do them 1 stitch at a time. All right, so now we have 3 little stitches happening there, and all of our underneath stitches are going to the right, and all of our finishing stitches are going to the left. Now let's talk about how to save some time, because I'm all about saving time. So instead of doing 1 stitch at a time, meaning starting it and finishing it each time, I'm actually going to do a series of half stitches all the way across, and then I'll come back and finish them all off at the same time. And a half stitch is a good thing to know how to do anyways, because some patterns actually call for half stitches. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to come up. We're going to do another row down here. So I'm just going to come up down here in my bottom left corner, and I'm going to go in to the top right corner, and that's a half stitch. So we've completed half our stitch. Now we're going to do another one, but instead of finishing that stitch, I'm actually just going to make another half stitch. Okay, and let's do another one because this is really fast. Okay, so we can just keep on doing half stitches. I like to do this method if I'm filling in like an area where you're going to have a lot of stitches. I'll just go all the way across going one way, and then I'll go back across the opposite way. And it just makes it nice and fast. I can't see sideways. Okay. So there's our little series of half stitches, and now they're all going to the right. Now we need to come back to the left in order to finish them off. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to come back up now from the bottom right for each stitch and back in the top left to finish it off. So bottom right, it's hard to do this on camera. Top left, bottom right, top left. And so as you can see, it's actually really fast to stitch this way. So if I ever have somewhere where I have a large area to fill in, this is how I'll do it. Okay, and so here we have our stitches. Now let's go ahead and talk about how to stop. Say this is all we need of this color and now we need to stop. So we're going to turn our work over to the back side, and you kind of want to avoid knots in cross stitching. So that's why we did the loop method to start. There's no knot on the back. It's all nice and neat, and my back is super tidy and easy to see. So in order to end it, I'm just going to take my needle and I'm actually just going to run it underneath a few of these stitches, like usually 4 or 5, just till I feel like it's secure. So you can see there I've run my needle under, and I'm just going to pull that out. And now that thread is secure, we can go ahead and just take our scissors and just snip that off. Okay, so now our back is super nice and tidy, and you can tell the difference still because this side doesn't have little X's, this side does. Okay, so we're good there. Now let's talk about a second way to start, because now I just cut this off so I don't have a loop anymore. I've got raw edges on both ends. So this is my second favorite way to start. And I'm actually going to switch to a green, like another color, so you can kind of see what we're doing. Here's the front of our work. We're going to flip it over to the back. And just like we buried that thread to finish it, we're going to do the same thing to start it. So I'm actually going to take my needle and again, just go under 5 or 6 stitches. So just like that, and then we can pull that through. And remember, we have raw ends on both edges now. So I pull it through, and I do leave a little bit of a tail until I get a couple stitches done, and then we can chop that off. But as you can see, it was super easy to get started. So I'll hold that with my finger, flip it over, and we were going this way. We want to keep going the same way, and then I'll do a few stitches. So now we can do, and a lot of times if I'm doing this method, I'll go ahead and just do one complete stitch so I don't accidentally pull it out, because if you pull too hard, you can pull it out really easy. So I'm just going to do one complete stitch, and now that's nice and secure, and all we have to do now is just come back and just trim off this little tail so it's not sticking out. But our thread is nice and secured and buried, and now we can go ahead and start stitching. So how easy was that? Now let's say we only needed one of those little squares. We just need this one little tiny green one in there. So now I'm going to go ahead and flip it back over, and I'll just bury that thread again. I just needed a little one-off stitch there. Okay, and then now we can just clip that off. And we've got a cute little one green stitch with our blues. Okay, now we're going to go back to our blue thread because I want to show you one more way to start. This is the third way to start. This is my least favorite way. And this is, again, usually reserved for when I have short pieces and maybe if I'm starting and I don't have anywhere to bury my thread, but I don't have the loop. I don't have enough to do a loop. So we have raw edges on both ends of our floss. And so we're going to have to bury the floss kind of like we did here, but we're going to have to do it with our stitches. So essentially we're going to be stitching over our floss. So let's just come in up here, and I'm just going to come in from the top and out the back. And I just hold it with my finger, and then I'm going to leave this little tail right here. So now our goal is to cover this tail up with our stitches. Okay, and so for my next stitch, I need to come up through this bottom hole, I know. So I'm going to flip it over and just make sure, okay, so I'm going to make sure that my tail is within my stitch. So now that tail is kind of being held down with my stitch. And I'm going to do that 4 or 5 times until I get enough where that tail feels like it's nice and secure. So there's one stitch around my tail. Okay, now I'm going to bring my thread over. I'm going to come up from my bottom and down into the top right, just like normal. I'm going to make sure that I'm covering over this stitch, and then I'm going to come back up my bottom right and down into the top left. Okay, and again, we've stitched on top of our tail. Okay, so we're just going to keep doing that. So now I'm going to hopefully catch it from the bottom left, down into the top right, up in the bottom right. I'm going to flip it over again and just make sure that this tail's inside my loop, and then see how we're kind of slowly stitching over our tail. I don't like to do this method because I have to sit there and flip my work back and forth. So, oh look, we got a knot too. Perfect. So now we have a knot, which is great, and I wanted to be able to show you how to get the knot out. So here's our little loop, and I'm going to just stick my needle in that loop, and you can kind of pull some more out if you want, just to get that out of the way. Okay, so here's my loop. Hopefully you can see that, my knot. I'm gonna stick my needle in that loop and I'm just gonna pull up. And that pulls the knot right up to my needle. And then I can just, boop, pop it out. Perfect. Okay, so if you get a knot, don't panic. Just stick your needle in the loop and pull. You can also pull on one or other side of the thread if that helps. Your goal is to get that knot right up next to your needle so it's as tight as it can be, and then when you take your needle out, it will just pull that knot right out. Okay, so now we can just continue burying this thread in the back until we're done. All right, once we're done and this thread is nice and secure, then you can come in and just clip off those bits. Okay, so those are the 3 ways to start. Obviously, this third method is a little bit more time consuming and it's not my favorite. I prefer to do the loop method or to pre-bury my thread in stitches that are already there. I just think that's a lot easier. So those are the basic ways to do cross stitches. The important takeaway is that your bottom stitch is going to be leaning to the right and your top stitch is going to be leaning to the left. If you keep that in mind, you'll be good to go. There's one more stitch you need to know to be able to do the joy ornament, and it's called a back stitch. And that is indicated on your pattern by this straight line right here. And I'll scoot that up so that you can kind of see it. So this dark straight line right here is your back stitch, and all that means, that back stitches are so easy, all that means is instead of doing a little X, you're just going to do a straight line. So we're just going to pick a square here to come up for a sample. I'm just going to come up through one of my squares, and then however long your back stitch is, this particular one on this pattern, it looks like it goes over 3 squares. So we're just going to count over 3 squares, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and we're just going to go down. And voila, we have a straight back stitch. Now some of the back stitch won't be going through the actual holes. And as a matter of fact, on this one, it's actually going through the center of a square instead of out through one of the holes. And so in order to do that, lost my thread. Okay, in order to do that, instead of coming out through the holes, you're just gonna do your best, and this is the one time you're actually gonna sew through the actual fabric. So I'm gonna try to come out of the center of one of those squares instead of one of the holes. Hopefully that's coming up on camera. And then I'm going to count up 3 squares and go into the center of the fabric again. And that one you just have to give it a little bit harder push, but you can do it. And voila, now we have a second back stitch. Sometimes people use back stitches to outline an object in cross stitch, or do some words or do some string, like if there's little Christmas lights hanging from a string or something. So you'll just want to look at your pattern, but this is how you're going to do it and it will be so easy. Okay, and that's what my back is looking like. It's super nice and clean. Now one other thing I want to mention, especially if you're doing white fabric like we are here, is you can probably see our thread underneath this white fabric. And so if you had, say, a back stitch here, and then say you had another square clear out here, you would not want to just travel clear out here and start doing that, okay? Because you can for sure see that thread now running right here. That's not going to look good on your finished piece. So if you have a stitch out here, I would come up here and just do this one stitch. Or let's look at our joy ornament. We have a bunch of these little red ones kind of scattered around. You're not going to want to stitch this one and then drag your thread behind your fabric and stitch this one. Instead, what you're going to want to do is stitch all the green first, and then you can stitch this one, and then you can just bury your red behind the green and then stitch this one. But that way you can hide that thread behind that green so you don't have red thread on your showing through to the front of your fabric. So for example, let's grab our green thread again and let's do a green stitch right here. Okay, and now let's say I have another green stitch over here. I can flip this over, and just like I buried my thread when I started, I can run this thread kind of behind here. Just pick a couple. It doesn't have to be perfect because this is the back of your work. And I'll just bury it behind there. And now I can do another little stitch somewhere over here. And I don't have like a green piece of thread going across the back of my work. okay? And so that's how I'm gonna do it on our joy ornament. I'm gonna just bury those extra threads underneath something else so that you can't see it. So if I were to maybe go from this stitch to this stitch, you might be able to see, there's some blue here, but you might be able to see, you know, this stitch coming across the back there. But now that it's buried behind these threads, you can't see it. So super nice and easy. Now I want to show you one other thing, and don't do it till you're ready, but this is just how I kind of speed up my work. So I like to hold in hand, meaning I don't have an embroidery hoop on here. If you prefer embroidery hoop, go ahead and put one on. They're super easy. You just unscrew the top screw and pop it out, and then you take your fabric, center it on your hoop, and then, oops, picked up my needle, and then just spread it on there nice and even, and then you can tighten this back up, and then you can stitch on this. I don't particularly like stitching on this because I like to do the sewing method, which I'm going to show you next, and it really is difficult to do that on an embroidery hoop because it keeps your fabric so nice and stiff. Okay, so I'm just going to take that off. I just wanted to kind of show you. If you feel more comfortable doing that, go for it. But instead of stitching like we have been up here where I'm coming up and down, I like to do what's called the sewing method. So I'm going to go ahead and just bury my thread to start because I don't have a hoop on this one anymore because we've been messing with it so much. So I'm going to go ahead and just bury it, and then we're going to sew just like we have been. So we're going to come up like we have been, but instead of coming up and going down and coming up, that's kind of called, I think it's called the poke and stab method, as you're basically poking and stabbing. I'm going to do what's called the sewing method. So I kind of hold my fabric in hand just like this. I use my first two fingers to keep it nice and taut, and then I use my back fingers to kind of guide my needle. And I know that I need to go from bottom left to top right, and again I'm going to do bottom left, top right, bottom left, top right. So I'm going to come in this top hole and just kind of pivot around and out the bottom hole. So it looks like that. So what I'm doing is I'm finishing my half stitch, my right facing leg, but I'm setting myself up now to go and to do the second stitch. So now I'm already coming out of the bottom hole, so I can just do that again. And I can just continue. And this way I don't ever have to reach underneath my fabric. I can just sew just like you would if you were sewing clothing or whatever. I find this method to be a lot faster, and so I prefer to use this method. And there you go. So I just stitched all of those really fast. Now to go back, it would be kind of hard. I have to come in this top right and down in the bottom left, which I can do, but I'm like really turning my hand. So I'm actually just going to pivot my fabric around so that now it's a lot easier for me to go and make those left facing stitches. And I kind of use my needle and my finger underneath to kind of guide that thread. So I kind of go in this hole, pop it out the bottom hole, and now I can just finish off all of these, and I'm not having to kind of blindly stab from the back side and hope I come out the right hole. I can actually see what I'm doing here, and it's just a lot easier and faster. If you are confused by this, or if this just seems like too much for you, don't do it for now. Just go ahead and do it the way I showed you in the beginning, because the only thing that really matters, like I said, is that your stitches are all going the same way. So that's pretty much everything you're going to need to know. Let's talk about the joy ornament a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about these patterns. So this is the joy ornament pattern. This is a free download below this video, so make sure you download that. It's just right below the video. Click show more if you don't see the link. And let's just talk about what a basic cross stitch pattern looks like. So they should have a few things on them. They should have the pattern itself. They should also have a floss key so that you can see what flosses you need to use. Mine have a symbol, a color, the name, and then the actual color name. So if you're at the store and you can't find DMC 470, you can see that it's an avocado green light and you can substitute it for something else. Then it'll also have the length, which is basically how many skeins you're going to need. These ornaments are really small, so you're just going to need one of each color for the entire set. The other thing it should have is any extra supplies and some information about your stitching. So this particular one says that my stitch count is 31 stitches wide by 28 high, and it should finish at a roughly 2.5 by 2.5 inches. This one is stitched on 14 count white Aida, just like we said, and it uses 2 strands of DMC floss and a size 26 tapestry needle. So all of that information is basically telling you what the sample is stitched on if you want to get that exact same look. I've also included some finishing instructions on mine as well, along with a little link to these little 3-inch embroidery hoops and some decorative ribbon, just in case you want to finish them the exact same way that I do. So let's talk about patterns in general. There's usually a couple different kinds of patterns, and I would think it would say in the description, but every vendor is going to be different. This one is a color symbol chart, so you'll notice that all of the colors are completely filled in, but they also have these symbols. The symbol is going to match with the color up here. So let's do a close-up. You can see that this green is this kind of little microphone looking symbol, and then if you look right here, you'll see the green with the microphone. And so that is going to be your key on, so you know where to stitch what color. Some charts are black and white. If you're a beginner, these are not my favorite charts because while they still have these little symbols here, they can kind of be hard to read, and especially if you're stitching along, it's really easy to kind of mess up if you're not paying attention to the symbols. A lot of designers do black and white. I don't particularly prefer it, so I give you 3 color options. The third one is going to be the color symbol option, and I'll just hold this up a little bit closer. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but in real life it's actually very easy to see, and each of the symbols is there, but the symbol is actually in the color you need to stitch with, which makes it really nice and easy because as you're stitching, you can count the symbols really easily, you can tell what color they are, and it just makes everything nice and easy. So those are kind of the 3 different color schemes that my patterns come in. Of course, every designer is going to be a little bit different, but they should all be one of something similar to this. The other thing that you're going to find on patterns is this center arrow right here. Mine have red lines, and that indicates the exact center of the pattern, so you can kind of figure out where you want to start on your fabric. And then also these lines right here, you'll notice, are a thicker point line, and that means that within each one of these squares there's 10 squares across and 10 vertically. And so when you're counting, say you have a long row of stitches, it's a lot easier to count 10, 20, 30 stitches than to sit there and count them individually. So that's just a little handy thing to have, is these thicker squares. It really helps with counting and figuring out where you are in your pattern. So let's talk about our joy ornament just a little bit. I want to kind of discuss how I would go about sewing this. Now, since I need it to fit on a smaller piece of fabric, I'm probably going to kind of start off somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to be looking at our red middle lines, and then I'm also going to be just seeing kind of where the middle of my fabric is, and I'll start there. So I'll usually kind of look for a main center object to start out with, and then I'll build my way out from there. Now, as far as the holly goes, I'm going to go ahead and stitch all of the green first. That way I can stitch the red and bury my red thread behind the green, just like I showed in the demo video, and then I can stitch the pink and then bury that behind the green as well. That way I can travel all around the holly with those little one-off stitches and bury my thread behind it so you won't see it, and I don't have to keep stopping and starting for one stitch here and one stitch there. Now, if this pattern had like a border, I would actually start with the border and get all my border done, and then that way I would have a starting point and I can count in from the sides to start the design in the center. But this one doesn't have a border, and we want to make sure it fits on our smaller fabric, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the center. You can use these center lines right here, and you can actually kind of take your fabric and just fold it both directions so you have a little bit of a crease on your fabric, and you can iron this out later, but that's going to give you a really good idea of where your center is, and then you can kind of figure out where you want to start on your piece. So since my center is really close to this, I think we'll go ahead and start out with this ornament because I think that's going to be really easy. So I'm going to go ahead and just start sewing. Here's the center of my fabric, and I'm going to start off with the top of that ornament just like I said. So I'm going to be doing my 3 little gray X's right there to get started. And then once those are done, I'm going to just bury that gray thread behind the stitches just to kind of secure it, and then I'll cut it off. Again, we want to avoid any knots in the back of our cross stitch. And I'll go ahead and just trim that off. And then next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and start with my red. And I'm going to just do the half stitch method like I showed you before, where I'm stitching half stitches all the way across, and then I'll come back to finish those stitches off. And I just like to do that method when I'm filling in kind of a larger area because I just feel like it's faster. Once you get a little bit more experienced, you can also outline that ornament red, and then you don't even have to do the counting. You can just do the outline stitches and then just fill in the center. But I feel like that's a little bit harder to do because you have to pay attention to your outline. When beginning, I think just doing these rows one row at a time is a little bit easier. Of course, take any of my tips with a grain of salt. You can do whatever is easier for you or works better for you. So I'm just going to continue filling in the top of my ornament here. And if I were doing this just on my own, I would probably do all of that red ornament and just get it all done. For the sake of this video, I'm actually going to just do these first 3 rows of red, and then I'm going to bury my thread and trim it off so that I can kind of show you how I'm going to sew the green holly portion next. I did want to do a short little demo of me stitching on a hoop so you could kind of see what it's like. You do have to use that poke and stab method. You really can't do the sewing method with this, so the hoop is really just not my favorite. But again, you're going to want to do whatever you prefer. Some people really like the hoops. I just find they get more in my way than not. So here I am kind of struggling to go back and forth with my hoop, and I just get frustrated, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue on sewing my green holly. I'm just going to work my way across one side, and I'll probably just do this whole right side of holly first, and then I'll move over and do the left side of the green holly, and then I'm going to come back in and do my little 1 stitches. So I'm just showing you here that I'm going to bury my green thread so we can kind of talk about these little red stitches, and I'm just going to do the method where I pull my red thread through, do a couple stitches, and then trim it off. And now I can just continue doing my little red stitches. Once I get these 4 done, I've got some more down here at the bottom. So instead of stopping and starting, I'm just going to weave my thread behind that green so you won't be able to see it, and now I can just go down and do these little stitches right here without having to stop and start my thread a bunch. And now, instead of going, straight across my fabric there, I'm going to weave back up and across that green, and then now I can add these little one-offs down here on the bottom. And that's just how I sew whenever I have one-offs. I don't like to stop and start my thread too much because I just feel like it wastes a lot of time, and so I like to just bury them behind pre-existing stitches. So here I am doing that little back stitch, and like I showed you before, it's super easy. You're just going to follow the line on the pattern and just stitch it across, and then you can just bury that thread. Now, if I was planning ahead, I would have actually probably started off with the red on the ornament and then done the black 3 top stitches and then done that back stitch at the same time instead of stopping and starting that black thread, but I was just trying to show you the different stitches. So all right, so it looks like I've got most of my holly and my little red berries done, and now I'm going to work on these letters. So I'm just going to count across from my ornament. That's, like I said, the ornament is kind of my center focal point, and it's easy for me to orient myself once that's all done. And I'm just going to kind of work it out in my head. So if I go across the top row in half stitches, I can come back across it and then start that second row again and go across and back. And so when I'm stitching and looking at patterns, I just kind of look at the pattern and figure out what the most efficient way for me to get from one end of it to the next is. And so sometimes that's going all the way across in half stitches and all the way back, finishing them off. Sometimes it's finishing the full cross stitch as I go. And so I just work it out in my head, whatever's going to work the best, and that's what I do. I don't think there's really any rules here. I think you can kind of stitch however you like. As long as all your stitches are leaning the same way, you should be good to go. All right, so I've got those top stitches done, and now I'm just going to work my way down and across to finish off that J. And as you can see, I'm working down in half stitches, then I'll come back up to the top and work down that second row. And I always recount as I'm stitching in between just to make sure I have enough, because there's nothing worse than getting something completely stitched and realize you're off by a stitch or something, and dependent upon the pattern, that can really mess up the rest of your pattern. So always count twice. And once I'm done with my J, I'm gonna go ahead and just bury that thread like we have been doing this whole time, trim it off, and then I'll start a new piece for the Y ornament. Okay, so here we are, we're making some great progress. I'm gonna go ahead and just finish off our ornament. I'm gonna do the Y in the exact same way that I did my J, and then we'll be ready to finish our ornament. And I'll meet you back here in the next video and I'll show you how we're gonna finish it off so that we can make these cute little ornaments to hang on our Christmas tree. All right, guys, so that's going to be it for today's video. As you can see, cross stitch is super fun and easy. My main tips for cross stitching are some good lighting, and then I also have to wear my readers now just because it helps me see what I'm doing a little bit better. Otherwise, you can kind of just sit back and enjoy the process. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. In the next video, I will be showing you how to finish the ornament in this cute little hanging embroidery hoop. So thanks so much for joining me today. As always, if you have any comments or questions, leave those below. If you like this video, please make sure to thumbs up and subscribe. That really helps me out, and you can also hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of the upcoming fun. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you next time.